In this first lesson of my DMJX course, Typography with Many Variables, we will focus on type and on how to make type as readable as possible. Until a few years ago, the title of this course was Newspaper Design. No other media puts so heavy demands on the typography as the printed newspaper, because so many different text types have to be combined in so many different ways. My predecessor as the newspaper design expert of this school, Bent Rode, used to introduce his class like this. If you learn how to master newspaper typography, you will be able to master any kind of typography. However, as digital media appear to take the place of print, we have decided to change the focus of this course a little and put more emphasis on general typography. Still, in the last two assignments, you will be introduced to basic rules of layout and newspaper communication. When it comes to typography, digital media are becoming ever more refined, and some newspaper and magazine apps now showcase typography that is almost as sophisticated as that of printed publications. Here's a few examples. The New York Magazine, La Presse of Quebec, Canada, and Dagens Nyheter of Stockholm, Sweden. Well, here's an example of a printed publication where the typography is not very sophisticated. Dansk Folkeblad is being published by the Danish political party Dansk Folkeparti, and without even having to mention the politics of this party, I think we can agree that the design is pretty messy. Let's dwell for a while on this spread and see if you can define what makes the design so bad. Regardless of the quality of the design, the typography of a page in most printed publications can be divided into two categories. One is micro typography. The other one is, not surprisingly, macro typography. If a page contains nothing but micro typography, few people will read it. Unlike reading a book, newspaper reading is usually not a very intensive activity. You will often be distracted by other things. The TV, your kids, other commuters if you're reading the newspaper in a train or a bus. You can compare the newspaper reader to a helicopter. Viewing the page from a distance and looking for a place to land. The job of the page designer is to create landing spots. These landing spots can be seen as a top layer of the page, containing elements that are more visually appealing than the micro typography, such as images and macro typography. Macro typography are shorter text elements which have been elevated to the top layer by making them bigger, bolder, and shorter, in order to catch the attention of the reader and make the helicopter land. Then, if the landing spots have stirred the reader's appetite for more, he or she may descend to the bottom layer in order to read the story in full. However, the macro typography should not merely be seen as bait. It should also work as a super condensed version of the contents, helping the reader to decide what to read and what not to read in depth. As Ellen Lupton puts it in her book Thinking with Type, one of design's most humane functions is to help readers avoid reading. Besides creating landing spots, Another important function of the macro typography is to provide the publication with a certain visual style, whereas the most important function of the micro typography is to make the publication as easily readable as possible. Of course, this doesn't mean that there are no style issues when dealing with micro typography, or that the macro typography does not have to be readable. Now let's talk a little about the reading process. An experienced reader doesn't focus on every single letter of a text. Instead, he or she will jump quickly from one point of the text to the next, recognizing word units and, to some extent, guessing what is in between the fixations. This means that in order to have maximum readability, a letter should be recognizable even if you do not focus on it. Even if it is blurred. Now look at these two versions of the word onsdag, that is Danish for Wednesday. Which one do you think is the easiest one to read? If you preferred the serif version, like I did, have a closer look at the letter shapes and try to figure out why they are more readable than the sans version. It's all about differences. Now the terms readability and legibility are often used randomly, while some experts make sharp distinctions between the two. If you're curious to know the difference between readability and legibility, feel free to search the internet for discussions. Certain features characterize those typefaces which we usually regard as the most legible ones. These features are a relatively tall X height, clearly different letter shapes, relatively wide letters with large open counters, and moderate contrast between the thin and the thick lines of the letters. In the following, I'll go through these one by one. The X height is what you might call the corpus of a typeface, without any ascenders or descenders. Mathematically speaking, it is simply the height of the lowercase x. Typefaces with a low X height, such as Bembo, will look smaller than typefaces with a tall X height, even if the point size remains the same. It may be hard to believe, but these 6 lines of text do in fact share the same point size. Remember the two versions of the word onsdag, Danish for Wednesday? The main reason why the sans typeface was not as readable as the serif one is that the letters look pretty much alike. The individual characters of a typeface should be clearly distinguishable. Gill Sans is a typeface where you can easily confuse the uppercase I, the lowercase l, and the numeral 1, as opposed to the new Adobe typeface Source, where these 3 characters are clearly different. These individual differences are making Source easier to read than Gill Sans. Typefaces with open letter shapes are easier to read than those with less open shapes. The holes inside letters such as O and E are called counters. Here's the logo of an imaginary news website about European football, also called soccer. The choice of a Helvetica may lead to an attractive logotype, but if you go for maximum legibility, Frutiger will be a better choice. Can you see why? A few years ago, legibility issues led to the creation of a brand new typeface by the name of Retina. For years, the Wall Street Journal had been using Helvetica condensed for its stock exchange tables. However, as we've already seen, some letters of Helvetica can be easily confused, and even more important, some numerals. In small sizes and with less than perfect printing, you might confuse the numerals 3, 5, 6, and 8. That's a problem if you're trying to run a business paper. If readers are about to invest their money in a company, they need to know its exact value on the stock exchange. With Retina, the Wall Street Journal managed to save space while improving legibility at the same time. Let's have a closer look at Retina. In order to make the characters as legible as possible, even in very small sizes, the designers created so-called ink traps, which make the letter shapes as open as they can possibly get. They also make the letters look rather strange when magnified. Contrast is basically a good thing in design, but sometimes you can have too much of a good thing. Typefaces with moderate contrast between thick and thin lines are easier to read than those with very contrastful letter forms. In a typeface with very high contrast, such as Bodoni, it's not always easy to tell where one letter stops and the next one begins. And of course, that problem will get worse in bad lighting or with poor printing and in very small sizes. Bodoni is not the obvious choice for body type. In general, you should always have a look at your body type on a printed page, not on the screen, to see if the size is right. If type is too small, it will be hard to read, and authors will be tempted to write too long texts. On the other hand, there's no reason to waste precious space. If type is too big, fewer words can be perceived within each fixation. Italics are generally considered to be harder to read than Roman letters, for two reasons. One, in italics, differences between the individual letter shapes are more subtle, and two, we are not so used to reading italics. And as it was said by Susanna Lichko, founder of the Emigre Type Foundry, you read best what you read most. All capital print slows down speed of reading compared to lowercase type, which permits reading by word units. As the shape of any word written with uppercase letters is rectangular, all caps tend to be read letter by letter. All caps also take more space than lowercase. Therefore, more fixations are required for reading the same amount of material. Excessive use of bold letters reduces legibility because of the shiny dots that will appear in between letters and lines of text. See for yourself. Try to keep your eyes focused on the red E in the middle of the text until we switch to the next slide. Meanwhile, I'll let Paul McCartney play a little tune.
Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, but she doesn't have a lot to say. Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, but she changes from day to day. I wanna tell her that I love her a lot, but I gotta get a belly full of wine. Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, someday I'm gonna make her mine, oh yeah. someday I'm gonna make 'em mine.
And now look at the red dot in the middle of the grey square. The bold black letters from the previous slide generated light spots on your retina, and the white space in between them generated black spots. That's what will happen whenever you try to read a lot of very bold text. For similar reasons, the use of reverse type should be limited. Also, white text on a dark background can cause printing problems. No doubt this was supposed to be a very elegant advertisement for luxury clothing. But on newsprint, it turned out a mess. For text to be readable, the most important thing is that it can be clearly distinguished from the background. This means there has to be contrast, which is not the case if you print fine black type on a dark red background. As a general rule, type on a colored or shaded background should be bigger and bolder than on a white background. When printing text on halftone screens, consider the relation between the screen resolution and the type size. A low screen resolution will increase the risk of screen dots interfering with the letter shapes. If we zoom in on the text, it's easy to see how hairlines and serifs are blurred by the raster dots of the background. As a rule, sans serifs are easier to read on a shaded background than serif typefaces. If you wish to print fine type on a shaded background, try to avoid using black when mixing the background color. Black raster dots will blur serifs and hairlines. If you want a gray shade, use a combination of cyan, magenta, and yellow. If the contrast between text and background is too small, reading the text will be harder. And if the colors of text and background share the same lightness, it will create a flickering effect which impairs reading. You can check these things by making a grayscale copy of your page. As a general rule, the difference in lightness between the text and the background should be at least 70%. Narrow letters look smaller than regular type and have a tendency to coalesce. If two wide letters are being used, fewer words can be perceived within each fixation. Also, whenever type is digitally condensed or extended, the original letter shapes are distorted, often leading to further impairment of reading. In the early days of desktop publishing, horizontal scaling of type was very popular, and a rock concert poster could look like this. Today, however, with more than 150,000 typefaces on the market, you ought to be able to find one that is narrow enough or wide enough to suit your needs. The choice of typeface is just one aspect of working with typography. A skilled typographer can make most typefaces look good, and it is easy to make any typeface look bad. Here's an example of a Danish magazine with really bad typography. The main problems concern the spacing between letters, words, and lines of text. That's what we call the typographical arrangement. One aspect is letter spacing. If letters tend to touch each other, reading will suffer. If the spacing between letters is too big, word units will dissolve and words become harder to recognize. As a general rule, whenever the point size is increased, the spacing between letters should be reduced. For space between characters, we use the term tracking. Never use letter spacing in lowercase text, as it reduces legibility. This rather strange quotation by the famed typographer Frederick Gaudy was in fact concerning black letter, the kind of letters used by Gutenberg. However, Gaudy's words are often used to express just how wrong it is to letter space lowercase text. On the other hand, all caps text will become easier to read with some spacing between the letters. Can you see why? By now you will understand that the treatment of letters, words and lines of text is really a complex system where one decision will always affect another. Successful typography is a question of balance. The spacing between the letters of a text should be big enough to make each letter distinguishable and small enough to let each word unit appear clearly. The spacing between the words of a text should be big enough to make each word unit stand out, but not so big that it can violate the horizontal reading flow. The distance between the lines of a text should be big enough to make it easy for readers to see where the next line of text starts, and not necessarily bigger. The columns of a text should be wide enough to facilitate a natural reading flow, but not so wide that readers may find it hard to see where the next line of text starts. For space between lines, we use the term leading. Typefaces with a low X height can be typeset with tighter leading than those with a taller X height. These lines are bembo with no extra leading. Typefaces with a tall X height should be typeset with more leading than those with a lower X height. These lines are Vectora with 6 points extra leading. Many people working with desktop publishing think it looks very professional when text is justified, giving every line of text the same width. Just like in a book. However, justified text is not always doing readability a favor. For less trained readers in particular, short lines of justified text can be hard to read due to the uneven spacing and frequent hyphenation. As opposed to ragged right, which will create even spacing between words and reduce the risk of rivers, which can often be seen in justified text. But if ragged right is more readable, what's the case against it? Well, justified text can create a sense of order in a very complex and lively typographical arrangement, like this newspaper page. On the page to the right, with fewer elements and a quieter typographical environment, the ragged right text adds a bit of variety at the same time as it makes the rather long text units easier to read. Again, it's a question of balance. There's no typographical solution that will be right in any case. Finally, let's go back to contrast. We can use contrast to make our content inviting and to show what is most important. But if we combine too many different typefaces and type sizes in one text, we might confuse our readers. Combining two different typefaces is a very common way to achieve contrast. As a rule of thumb, You will get the best results by combining a sans serif with a serif typeface. Mixing two typefaces that belong to the same category can be risky. Most readers will perceive the subtle differences between two related typefaces as inaccuracies rather than contrasts. Can you tell how many different typefaces were used to write these words? And can you point out where the type changes? Frutiger and Universe share a number of features and were even designed by the same man, Adrian Frutiger. They are too alike to be good companions. The same is true of Caslon and Times, two typefaces both belonging to the so-called group of transitional serif typefaces. Whether different typefaces suit each other is to some extent a matter of taste and fashion. In 1988, David Hillman's combination of Garamond and Helvetica in the new logotype of The Guardian was quite revolutionary, and many people thought it looked terrible. As it turned out, this break with tradition would mark the beginning of a new trend, allowing much more contrastful typeface combinations than before. Therefore, even though I'm personally not very fond of this particular typeface combination, taken from a Danish fashion magazine, I wouldn't dare dismissing it as bad typography. What I can say, however, is that I don't like it. Now let's see if you're familiar with all your options when working with contrast in typography. What's the opposite of small? Okay, now I'm going to keep quiet for a while and leave the talking to you. Try to name the opposite of each word, and in a few cases there's even a third option. That's all for now. Thank you for watching.
Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, but she doesn't have a lot to say. Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, but she changes from day to day. I wanna tell her that I love her a lot, but I gotta get a belly full of wine. Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, someday I'm gonna make her mine, oh yeah, someday I'm gonna make her mine.